The air, 28,000 feet above the Rhine, was not air at all. It was a crystalline, freezing void, a medium designed only for death and silence. Major Robert Macready wasn't focused on the cold that seeped through his electrically heated suit, nor the dull ache in his jaw from clenching it against the G-forces. He was focused only on the sickening rumble in his engine, a subtle vibration that told him the delicate machinery of his P-51D Mustang, named the Ghost, was unhappy. He dropped slightly below the protective blanket of his squadron, the 357th Fighter Group, just long enough to try and coax the Packard Merlin back into its smooth, high-altitude song. That single moment of isolation, a deviation of maybe 3 miles from the main formation, was enough. The sky, moments ago a calming expanse of blue, cracked open like shattered glass. He saw them first not as machines, but as streaks of black smoke against the brilliant white contrails of the distant B-17s they were supposed to be guarding. Dozens of them, diving from the sun at an impossible angle. This wasn't a skirmish. This was the entire hornet's nest swarming out for the kill. He counted at least 40 interceptors, a terrifying mix of Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Me-109s, all organized, all descending on the exposed flank of the bomber stream like famished predators. And he was alone. Mac realized instantly that his wingmen were miles away, dealing with another wave, or perhaps still blinded by the sheer altitude. The B-17s were vulnerable, their staggered formation offering up a perfect target package. Mac's stomach dropped further than the altitude gauge. If he turned to run, the Focke-Wulfs would shred the bombers before his squadron could even turn around, let alone gain the necessary altitude advantage. If he stayed, 40 German fighters would converge on one solitary American P-51 in a terrifying 5-minute frenzy that would seal his fate. But the sight of the lead B-17, the city of Dallas, already trailing wisps of smoke from a preliminary pass by a high-altitude Me-109, erased the calculation of survival from Mac's mind. His job was protection, his training was dedication, and his aircraft was, at this very moment, the sharpest weapon the Allies possessed. He shoved the throttle forward, ignoring the protesting whine of the supercharger, manually adjusting the propeller pitch to max performance. The Mustang leapt forward, its laminar flow wing slicing through the thin air, accelerating with a ferocity that seemed unnatural. He aimed for the center of the approaching German formation, determined to carve a path of confusion and chaos, trading his certain demise for the chance to buy the heavies the critical minutes they needed to reach their target. Major Macready had always understood the brutal geometry of air combat, the cold calculus that governed who lived and who vaporized into a cloud of aluminum shards. He knew better than most that the P-51D was a magnificent machine, a marvel of range and speed unmatched in 1944. But physics was absolute, and a single Mustang engaging 2 full squadrons of interceptors defied all known tactical doctrine. Mac, known as the Lone Wolf, not because he sought isolation, but because his aggressive tactics frequently left his wingmen struggling to keep pace, was now truly isolated. He dipped his nose slightly, gaining speed towards the sound barrier, the Merlin engine bellowing its challenge to the frozen German sky. His initial objective wasn't to kill, it was to disrupt. The German formation, precise and lethal, was counting on shock and mass to overwhelm the bomber defenses. Mac's strategy was simple: dive headlong into the center, force them to scatter, and break the coordinated assault before it began. He focused on the lead element of Focke-Wulf 190s, the stout radial-engined fighters known for their blistering rate of roll and devastating cannon armament. They were formidable opponents, but at this altitude, the P-51's superior power-to-weight ratio and greater speed gave Mac the energy advantage he needed for the initial pass. He armed his 6.5 caliber machine guns, the comforting click a fleeting reassurance amidst the rising adrenaline. He held the stick steady, his eyes scanning for the inevitable defensive break. The German pilots, startled by the sight of a lone American fighter hurtling towards them like a vengeful missile, didn't immediately react, their discipline momentarily shattered by the audaciousness of the move. At 500 yards, Mac pressed the trigger. The sight of the tracers, thick rivers of incandescent light streaming from the Mustang's wings, was beautiful and terrifying. He didn't fire long, just a 3-second burst aimed squarely at the lead FW-190. The cannon shells ripped into the Focke-Wulf's engine cowling, and a plume of black oil and white steam instantly erupted. The pilot never even had time to try and pull up. The stricken fighter snapped violently to the left, tumbling end over end, a flaming coffin plummeting towards the distant landscape of the Ruhr Valley. The shockwave of the blast momentarily rattled Mac's airframe. But the death of one pilot bought life for the city of Dallas. The dive had cost Mac most of his altitude, trading precious vertical separation for blinding speed. He pulled out of the pass aggressively, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat, momentarily graying his vision. His head snapped left and right, trying to track the 20 or 30 enemy fighters now milling around in confusion, realizing their numerical advantage had been temporarily neutralized by sheer impudence. The critical 5-minute window had begun, and the air was now thick with noise, the roar of engines, the percussive thud of cannon fire directed at the distant bombers, and the terrifying whistle of approaching rounds. Mac knew he couldn't stay in a level turn with the FW-190s. Their rate of roll was too fast, and he would quickly become vulnerable. He needed to use his speed and diving capability, forcing the Germans into a constantly changing energy state. He saw 3 Messerschmitt 109s, their slim profiles distinctive, attempting to reform into a compact combat box aimed at the rear element of the B-17s. This was the immediate threat. Without hesitation, Mac initiated a textbook high yo-yo maneuver, a climb that traded speed for altitude, allowing him to pull the nose around and drop down onto their tails. He felt the cold sweat on his forehead, despite the freezing cabin air. He was fighting on instinct, pushing the limits of the airframe past the safety margins. As he reached the apex of his climb, the first defensive fire aimed at him struck his aircraft. Not cannon fire, but heavy machine gun rounds from an opportunistic FW-190 that had momentarily climbed above him. Pang! Pang pang! A sickening shudder ran through the tail section. Mac instantly slammed the stick to the right and stomped on the rudder pedals, executing a violent snap roll that broke the engagement, just as a stream of 30mm cannon shells flashed past where his cockpit had been a second before. He was committed now. He found the Messerschmitts he had targeted still focused on the bombers, their pilots too confident in their position to properly clear their 6. Mac dropped like a hawk, lining up the trail Me-109 in his sight. He had to be quick.
The second German fighter was already peeling off to defend. Mac fired, a long, devastating burst that walked up the fuselage of the tail enemy. The 109 dissolved in a sheet of flame and glycol, pieces of the vertical stabilizer shearing off violently. He didn't wait to watch it fall. He was already pulling hard to the right, using the remaining energy to escape the defensive turn of the second Messerschmitt. The air was turning into a deadly blender, visibility reduced by smoke and the sheer number of aircraft. The fight had devolved into a desperate, turning melee, a frantic dance where the difference between life and wreckage was measured in microseconds and millimeters of control stick movement. Mac was no longer engaging targets, he was engaging threats. The Germans, initially shocked, were beginning to coordinate their attacks, utilizing the classic Luftwaffe tactic of simultaneous attack from different angles, a high pass followed immediately by a low deflection shot. He saw the glint of sun on a canopy behind him, a fast FW-190 gaining rapidly. Mac poured coal to the Mustang, pushing the boost override, but the Focke-Wulf was closing. He had to break the line of sight immediately. Knowing the German pilot would anticipate a standard hard turn, Mac did the opposite, a slight, gentle roll to the left, followed by a sudden, gut-wrenching bunt and dive. The negative G-force slammed his body against the restraints, his headset rattling. The German pilot, expecting the hard turn, overshot slightly, his tracers ripping harmlessly through the space Mac had vacated. This break gave Mac the precious half-second he needed. He inverted and pulled back on the stick, executing an Immelmann turn, a half-loop followed by a half-roll, converting his downward speed back into altitude and putting him directly behind the FW-190 that had just tried to kill him. This was the lethal beauty of the P-51. Its range and speed allowed for maneuvers that tired out the shorter-legged German fighters. He didn't waste the opportunity. He squeezed the trigger. His tracer fire bracketed the Focke-Wulf's cockpit. The German plane staggered, then exploded with a muffled roar, showering Mac's canopy with oily debris. That was his third confirmed kill in under 3 minutes, but the cost was mounting. The Mustang was responding sluggishly. He checked his instrument panel. Oil pressure steady, coolant temperature rising slightly, but the stick felt heavy, unresponsive. Then he saw the damage. A bullet hole, perhaps a 20-millimeter round, had punched a clean, horrifyingly precise hole just aft of the starboard wing root near the aileron controls. The hydraulic lines were weeping fluid, slicking the wing surface. Any further damage to the flight controls, and he was nothing more than a high-speed glider. He was fighting 3-1, then 5-1, constantly maneuvering, his neck aching from the frantic head swiveling, trying to predict the next attack vector. The sheer number of enemies meant that while he was lining up a shot on one, 2 others were inevitably lining up on him. He could hear the bomber crews miles above the general chatter, broadcasting their distress calls. They were still under heavy fire, but the main thrust of the interceptors had shifted, drawn by the audacity and menace of the Ghost. Mac was successfully acting as a lightning rod, drawing the storm towards himself, sacrificing his clean airframe for the survival of the mission. The exhaustion was physical, relentless, and absolute, compressing his vision and dulling the razor sharpness of his reaction time. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps despite the supplemental oxygen. 3 minutes and 40 seconds had elapsed since he opened fire, and Mac felt like he had aged a decade. The hydraulic leak was becoming critical. He had to exert immense physical force just to keep the P-51 tracking straight, making fine adjustments for deflection shooting almost impossible. As he was trying to line up a shot on a Me-109 that was chasing a crippled B-17, the German fighter abruptly broke away. Not because Mac was on its tail, but because a flash of cannon fire erupted from Mac's starboard side. A Focke-Wulf, closing unnoticed from the sun, had delivered a crippling blow. The sound was deafening, a sledgehammer striking metal. The right side of his fuselage shuddered violently, and the cockpit filled instantly with the acrid smell of burning insulation and ruptured metal. Mac felt a searing pain rip across his left shoulder, followed immediately by the warm, thick sensation of blood soaking his flight jacket. The impact spun the Mustang sideways momentarily, sending him into a sickening, uncontrolled skid. For a horrifying instant, Mac thought he was done, his control shot to pieces, spiraling towards the earth. But the P-51, resilient even when mortally wounded, responded marginally to his desperate corrections. The controls were mushy, the rudder pedals almost useless, but he had rudimentary control. He leveled out, dropping further towards the deck, spitting blood from a cut lip. He was alive, but the fight had tilted drastically against him. He was a sitting duck now, relying purely on momentum and luck. He could see two Focke-Wulfs peeling off to finish him. They knew he was damaged. They could smell the fuel and the fear. They were closing fast, eager for the easy kill. But as his lone P-51 limped, trailing white smoke, he had already bought the bombers 4 minutes of distraction. 4 minutes they desperately needed. 4 minutes during which their own gunners had a chance to inflict serious damage on the scattered enemy. This whole war was a constant weighing of risk against reward, the necessity of the mission against the sanctity of life. When you push the boundaries this far, engaging odds that statistically guarantee your death, when does bravery stop and reckless abandon begin? When does protecting the mission transition into a foolhardy sacrifice? Looking at the two Focke-Wulfs lining up for the final pass, I wonder what you, watching this right now, believe is the line Macready crossed. Let us know in the comments below, because for Mac, that question didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the next 5 seconds. The two Focke-Wulfs were textbook in their execution. They approached from slightly different vectors, ensuring that if Mac turned to avoid one, he would present a broadside target to the other. Mac, struggling with the unresponsive controls, knew he couldn't outmaneuver them conventionally. His speed was draining, and the damaged wing was fluttering unnervingly. But Mac had one advantage left: desperation and the sheer unpredictability of a dying pilot. He initiated a shallow, controlled side slip, a technique often used in landing, but almost suicidal in combat. The slip reduced his airspeed dramatically and threw off the tracking of the lead German fighter, whose shells streamed past Mac's starboard wingtip. Just as the lead FW-190 flashed past, Mac saw his opportunity. The second German pilot, expecting Mac to maintain his trajectory, was now positioned slightly high and behind. Mac slammed the stick forward and to the left, initiating a rapid diving spiral, pulling almost negative Gs again. This maneuver was completely alien to the combat doctrines of the day and seemed to defy logic. Why dive away when you needed speed? But Mac's goal wasn't evasion, it was to bait. The second Focke-Wulf, committed to the attack, pushed its nose down to follow the dive. This was the error Mac gambled on. The FW-190, excellent at medium altitude, became sluggish and heavy in a high-speed dive at altitude, sacrificing its maneuverability for speed. As the German plane began to accelerate, Mac yanked the stick violently back toward his chest, fighting the immense drag and the sluggish controls. The P-51 groaned in protest, but the powerful engine held, pulling him into a near-vertical climb, a desperate Chandelle maneuver. He pulled up so sharply that the German, committed to the dive, shot right past him below, unable to pull up quickly enough to match the unexpected vertical transition. For a split second, the belly of the FW-190 was perfectly framed in Mac's reflector sight. He held the trigger down for a full 7 seconds, emptying nearly a third of his remaining ammunition into the German fighter's exposed underside. The Focke-Wulf erupted in a fireball of white phosphorus and black smoke, breaking apart violently. That was 4. The physical effort required for that maneuver nearly blacked him out. The effort to keep the wounded Mustang flying straight was agonizing. He tasted metallic blood, but the psychological boost was immense. He had survived the killing blow, and he had taken another hunter with him. The remaining German pilots, scattered and demoralized, witnessed the destruction of their 4th and 5th comrades by a single severely damaged Mustang. The 5th kill, moments after the 4th, came as Mac completed his pull-up and found another Me-109 attempting to transition away from the fight. The Messerschmitt pilot, startled by the sudden appearance of the vengeful ghost above him, tried to escape into a cloud bank. Mac, fueled by pure adrenaline and the taste of success, pushed the damaged P-51 to its limit, firing a short, precise burst that caught the Me-109's wing root. It wasn't a spectacular explosion, but the 109 spiraled down, defeated, its chance of continued combat gone. This was the psychological turning point. The 5-minute mark was fast approaching, and in that time, Macready had not only survived an overwhelming ambush, but had decimated the spearhead of the German attack, claiming 5 confirmed kills and contributing to the dispersal and confusion of at least a dozen others. The Germans were professional, disciplined, and brave, but they were also trained to fight effectively, not suicidally. They were accustomed to overwhelming the escorts, not being routed by a lone wounded fighter. The sight of the ghost, trailing smoke and appearing indestructible, had broken their attack spirit. Their coordinated assault dissolved completely. Instead of pressing the attack on the bombers, the remaining interceptors began to execute high-speed escapes, jettisoning their external tanks and diving towards the cover of the lower clouds. They had lost the element of surprise. They had lost 5 fighters, and they had failed to prevent the bombers from continuing their path toward the critical target. The 5 minutes of insanity were over. The air immediately felt strangely quiet, the immense echoing silence only punctuated by the labored breathing of Macready and the ragged roar of his wounded Merlin engine. The B-17 gunners, moments before bracing for impact, could now only watch the retreating silhouettes of the German fighters. A wave of radio chatter broke through Mac's headset. Not distress, but stunned disbelief and gratitude from the bomber crews. He had achieved the impossible, sacrificing his aircraft's integrity and his own safety to redefine the concept of fighter escort. Air superiority wasn't just about overwhelming numbers, it was about the presence of a single, utterly determined individual who could shatter the morale of the enemy through sheer, terrifying skill. Mac had held the sky for the 8th Air Force, proving that even a single Mustang, flown by a determined ace, could break the most organized defense. But he was far from safe. He was alone, bleeding, and hundreds of miles over enemy territory.
The sheer relief that the German fighters were gone was quickly replaced by the terrifying realization of his own predicament. He was severely damaged, bleeding profusely from his shoulder wound, and the P-51 was struggling to stay airborne. The engine sounded rougher now, perhaps starved of oil from a punctured line, or maybe just protesting the savage treatment it had endured. The hydraulic fluid was almost certainly gone, meaning he had to rely entirely on muscle and trimming for flight control, a near impossibility for hundreds of miles. He leveled the aircraft out at 18,000 feet, nursing the power gently, trying to preserve the Merlin. He looked back toward the bomber formation, which was now flying past him, tight and resolute, having passed through the most dangerous phase of the interception thanks to his actions. He gave a thumbs-up gesture, even though no one could see it. He had done his job. Now came the hardest part, the 4-hour journey home. The sky, momentarily clear, was threatening to cloud over, and he knew descending into the lower altitudes meant flying into the flak envelope around German cities, something he desperately needed to avoid with his limited control authority. He checked his oxygen supply, low. He checked his fuel, enough, but barely, if he maintained a perfect, economical cruise setting, which was difficult given the airframe damage. Mac fumbled clumsily with his left hand, tearing a strip of cloth from his map case and tightly bandaging the throbbing wound in his shoulder. The cold was now his enemy, infiltrating the cockpit through the new holes and stiffening his muscles, making the necessary minute adjustments to the control stick nearly unbearable. He adjusted the trim tab, trying to find a configuration where the aircraft would fly hands-off, even for a moment, to give his weary arms a rest. He found a sweet spot, a precarious equilibrium, where the damaged P-51 drifted slightly to the right but didn't demand constant correction. He had successfully saved the bombers, neutralized the enemy threat, and survived the 5 minutes of madness. But surviving the flight home, wounded, alone, and relying on a damaged machine required a different kind of courage. The grinding, solitary endurance that separated pilots from heroes. He fixed his gaze on the distant horizon, hoping for the sight of the English Channel, his personal beacon of survival, knowing that every single revolution of the propeller was a victory against overwhelming mechanical failure. The return journey was less a flight and more a desperate act of will against physics. Mac flew in a state of suspended animation, his mind dulled by pain, focusing only on the distant sun angle and the compass heading. Hours bled into one another. He passed through patchy clouds, the sudden lack of visual reference sending his heart rate spiking, forcing him to rely solely on the unreliable attitude indicator and his sense of balance. The slightest turbulence threatened to throw the wounded Mustang into a spin it wouldn't recover from. He thought of his crew chief back in England, the meticulous sergeant who polished the Ghost every night and knew every rivet of the plane. How would he react when he saw the holes punched through the fuselage, the twisted aileron, and the oil weeping from the engine cowling? Mac knew he had pushed the machine beyond its intended limits, demanding maneuvers that would have ripped the wings off lesser fighters. The mental strain was immense. Every shadow, every flicker of movement on the ground below suggested a lurking enemy fighter or a waiting flak battery. He flew a meandering course, avoiding all known population centers, sticking to the edge of the range limits of German radar. He began talking to himself, softly at first, then louder, reciting flight checklists and procedures, anything to keep his focus sharp and ward off the creeping fatigue. He checked his fuel gauges again, critically low. He had to begin his descent and prepare for the channel crossing,
a stretch of freezing water that offered little mercy to ditching pilots. As he began the gentle, almost imperceptible descent towards the coast, he heard the faint, beautiful crackle of English voices on the radio. His squadron, the 357th, was calling his call sign, Ghost Leader. He keyed the microphone, his voice hoarse and weak. The final leg across the channel was terrifyingly slow. The engine coughed twice, a warning that the fuel pumps were beginning to gulp air. He pulled the mixture control back slightly, trying to nurse the last drops of 100-octane fuel through the hungry Merlin. When the white cliffs of Dover finally appeared, faint but undeniable through the hazy English air, Mac nearly wept with exhaustion. He had made it. He was met by two P-47 Thunderbolts, massive and reassuring, which took station on his wings. The Thunderbolt pilots, young and respectful, didn't attempt any maneuver. They simply escorted the battered, smoking P-51 to its home base. Landing the Ghost was a monumental challenge. With zero hydraulics, the landing gear had to be manually cranked down, a slow, agonizing process that taxed Mac's injured shoulder to its absolute limit. He felt the grinding resistance of the mechanism, his muscles screaming in protest. Once the wheels were down and locked, he had to rely entirely on differential braking and careful engine throttling to keep the heavy fighter tracking straight on the runway. He touched down hard, the landing gear protesting the impact, but the Mustang held. As he taxied to a halt, the ground crew rushed out, their initial shouts of relief turning into stunned silence as they saw the carnage inflicted on the aircraft. The Ghost was a wreck, the fuselage pocked with holes, oil streaking the wings, and the tail section riddled with heavy caliber machine gun fire. The sergeant, Mac's crew chief, stood frozen, holding a fire extinguisher, his face a mask of horror and awe. Mac cut the engine, and the ensuing silence was absolute, heavier than the roar of 100 Merlins. He sat there for a long moment, unable to move, before the ground crew helped him gently lower himself from the cramped cockpit. His left shoulder was saturated with blood, his face was smeared with oil and dust, and he staggered slightly as he hit the tarmac. He looked back at his plane, his savior, and whispered a word of thanks. The debriefing that followed was marked by profound skepticism. 5 kills in a 5-minute solo engagement against 2 full squadrons while saving the core bomber formation? It sounded like the wild delusion of a concussed pilot. Mac simply pointed to the damaged airframe and then the critical piece of evidence, the gun camera footage. They ran the film that evening. The darkened room was silent as the flickering images showed the terrifying high-speed passes, the immediate destruction of 3 German fighters in rapid succession, and the final close-range bursts that claimed the other 2. The film was irrefutable proof. Macready hadn't just survived, he had dominated a sky full of enemies, turning a planned German victory into a rout that proved definitively that the will of a highly skilled pilot in a superior aircraft could overcome any numerical odds. His 5 minutes redefined the air war over Germany, setting a new terrifying precedent for the Luftwaffe about the lethal prowess of the American lone wolf. His heroic defense of the bomber stream ensured the mission's success and cemented the Mustang's reputation as the master of the sky. But the legend of Major Macready was only just beginning to spread through the 8th Air Force. His story would become the whispered confidence that every pilot needed, the knowledge that even when separated and alone, they held the key to victory in their hands. He was immediately recommended for the Medal of Honor, though Mac himself maintained he was simply doing his job, albeit slightly off script, a fact he delivered with a dry, tired smile before finally allowing the medics to tend to his wounds. He was a man defined by a terrifying 5 minutes, a moment of chaos that bought the Allies the necessary step forward toward ultimate air superiority. The legend of the Ghost would haunt the German skies until the very end of the war, a chilling reminder of the single American pilot who decided he would not break, and in doing so, broke the spine of the enemy's defense. The strategic ramifications were immense. German command had to acknowledge that their defensive line was no longer impenetrable, not even with massive numbers, if a pilot of Macready's caliber chose to engage. The skies above the Reich had fundamentally changed, and it was all thanks to one badly damaged P-51 and its determined pilot. Macready became the embodiment of the phrase, "In the air, one is none, two is one, and five is air superiority." For him, one was five, and five was victory. He became the living proof that morale and audacity were weapons as effective as the 6.5 caliber machine guns mounted in his wings. His achievement galvanized the fighter groups, proving that the escort mission was not just defensible, but achievable even against staggering odds. This singular 5-minute battle shifted tactical doctrine, encouraging more aggressive breakup attacks and confidence in the Mustang's ability to handle multiple engagements. The story told and retold across the airfields of East Anglia solidified the image of the American ace as an unstoppable force, a ghost in the machine that the Luftwaffe could not exorcise. Mac's bravery, while singular, fueled the collective determination of the entire 8th Air Force, reminding every bomber crew that the Mustangs would always be there, even if only one remained. If this story of courage, endurance, and the defining moments of air combat touched your heart and reminded you of the immense sacrifices made in the skies of World War II, please subscribe to WW2 Lore for more detailed accounts of the legendary planes, heroic pilots, and intense battles that secured Allied victory.